Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's exactly 3 o'clock in Singapore, 9 a.m. In Paris. Welcome to this new book talk of the Middle East Institute. We have the pleasure today to have with us Stéphane Lacroix, who's going to be discussing his new book, The Twilight of the Saints, The History and Politics of Salafism in Contemporary Egypt, which was published a month ago. Uh, yes,
I'm trying to show it, but it's blurred.
it's blurred, unfortunately, but we'll make
That's
sure.
you.
Uh,
It's on
it's on
the.
the website. We have the cover on the website. So yes, the book just came out with Columbia University Press. Before we turn to you, Stefan, for the presentation of the book, let me just introduce you to my colleagues. So Stéphane Lacroix is an associate professor in political science at Sciences Po, the Institute for Political Studies in Paris, as well as a senior researcher at the Center for International Research at Sciences Po. His work has been dealing mostly with religion and politics, with a focus on the Gulf and Egypt. Prior to this book, he published, for instance, Awakening Islam, The Politics of Religious Dissent in Contemporary Saudi Arabia. Another book also on Saudi Arabia in transition, insights on social, political, economic, and religious change, which was co-authored with Bernard Haeckel and Thomas Hegghammer in 2015. So I'm not going to mention all your publications, but what's interesting, I think, is that you've been mostly, if I can say, in the past 2 decades, writing on Gulf issues and slowly moving towards Egypt. That actually begs the first question, because this is a book that discusses Salafism in Egypt. And for many people that are not familiar with religious topics in the Middle East, when we hear Salafism, the first assumption is that this is going to be about Saudi Arabia or, let's say, the Gulf. Can you tell us maybe the first question, the origins of the book? How did you start working your way toward that phenomenon of Salafism in Egypt?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to you all. As you said, my previous book was on Saudi Arabia, and in the book that I did on Saudi Arabia, I actually looked at something that went a little bit against the general assumptions. That is, everyone knows that there has been a movement of religion outwards from Saudi Arabia, that from the 1960s onwards, Saudi Arabia had a number of institutions whose role was to proselytize, that is, to export the Saudi understanding of Islam to the rest of the world. So in my book on Saudi Arabia, I actually looked what happened inside Saudi Arabia, and my claim was that actually Saudi Arabia imported as much Islam as it did export Islam. That was the point of my book on Saudi Arabia. And so I was looking at how Islamist movements from the region were, for reasons related to the Cold War context, given shelter in Saudi Arabia and how they were integrated at some point to key institutions within the Saudi system and what kind of consequences this had for Saudi Arabia. So that was my previous book. But on in this book, I came back to the general assumption that Saudi Arabia exported its own understanding of Islam to other parts of the world. But I tried to revisit that assumption. First, because now I knew Saudi Arabia much better, so I had a much more, I thought I had a much clearer understanding of what went on in Saudi Arabia itself. But also because I thought that there was something problematic with that narrative as if it was just a simple mechanical operation that Saudi Arabia would put so much money into proselytizing, and so that would explain why Salafism since the 1960s would become a global phenomenon. And and so looking at the different countries where Salafi movements are present, it seems to me that there are key differences. There are places where the Saudi export of Salafism functioned pretty well. There are places where it didn't function that well. So, in a sense, if Salafism had exported, if Saudi Arabia had exported Salafism to the whole world, Salafism would be present in the same way across the whole world. But it isn't. There are countries where the graft, where the export functioned, there are countries where it didn't. And so my question was, why did it work in some places? Why did Salafism establish a strong foundation in certain places? And why didn't that work as well in other places? Um, and Egypt seemed to me to be an interesting case because Egypt is a country that historically belongs to a very different Islamic tradition. Al-Azhar, the big university mosque in Cairo, has historically been the center of a more Sufi, rationalist oriented, not too rationalist, not overly rationalist, but more open to some form of rationalist theology type of Islam. And that is embodied in Egypt by that very powerful and very prestigious institution with a very strong and rooted tradition, again, in Sufism and in everything that Salafism doesn't really like. So Egypt was interesting because Egypt underwent a very strong Salafi transformation. It was very obvious for anyone visiting Egypt back then. I started doing the book in the late 2000s, and Salafi discourse was almost hegemonic within Egypt's religious sphere in the late 2000s. So my question was, why Egypt? Why did it work so well? What happened in Egypt that explains that this transformation happened in Egypt in ways that surpass by far what happened in other countries where there were many more resistances to the rise of Salafism? And so, of course, quickly I came to the reading that, well, it had to do with domestic circumstances. That is, in the end, domestic policies were what produced that outcome. So the question was then to understand domestically what happened, right? What were the political calculations made by a set of different actors going all the way back to the 1920s? So my book really covers a century, right? It's not a book that just talks about the last 20 years. It's a book that goes a long way back into trying to understand how Salafism established foundations going back to the first half of the 20th century, and how these, for a number of reasons, um, 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 you know, owing to different factors, some economic, some political, how Salafism eventually managed to win what I call the battle of religious ideas in the case of Egypt.
Said, let's start with how in the introduction in the first chapters you make the point that when we talk about Salafism, we should distinguish between Salafism as an idea or an ideology, a discourse, and Salafism as a social movement with its organizations, its actors, its individuals. And throughout the book, we see how the success of the idea doesn't always imply the success of the organizations, the institutions. Can you explain? I know it's you could take hours to do that, but can you explain that nuance between Salafism as an idea and Salafism as a movement?
Yeah, thank you. And I would add Salafism as a practice. So there's really three things here that need to be distinguished. And what I'm talking about in the book is in many ways conceptions of what is orthodox in Islam. This is what I'm looking at. The way people conceive of what is the Islamic norm. So the way people would tell you this is what a Muslim needs to do, or this is what a Muslim needs to believe. And this is the battle of our religious ideas I'm talking about. So when I say that by the late 2000s, Salafism had become almost hegemonic within the religious sphere in Egypt. I'm not saying that suddenly everyone started to dress or behave like a Salafi in Egypt. What I'm saying is that by the late 2000s, when people were asked what they thought was the correct way of being a Muslim, most people would give you a Salafi response. If you ask them about Sufism, what they thought about worshipping saints, that's age-old tradition in Egypt, most people would think it's frowned upon. What people would say it's this is not Islam. If you ask them what they thought of certain types of relation between men and women, they would give you a very Salafi understanding of how men and women should behave towards each other, right? Which doesn't mean that they all do this, right? And that's also the difference, and that's maybe the beauty of humans. Humans may think that there's a correct way to do things, but they might still do things in another way. And I had this conversation so many times when people told me, well, yes, I believe my wife should wear niqab, the full face veil, or my daughter should wear niqab, but she doesn't. But hopefully she will. But this is the correct way. This is what she should be doing. So that doesn't mean that people put the norms into practice. Some do, and many did in the late 2000s in Egypt. So there was a visible change happening. But of course, there's always a gap between what people believe and what they actually practice. Now, going back to movements, of course, that transformation of how people conceive of what is normative in Islam is carried out by movements. So what I'm describing in the book is that since the 1920s, you have a series of movements forming in Egypt that push for those types of understandings. And those movements do so in very different ways. The first that I describe in the book, the first movement, which is established in the late 1920s, is called Ansar Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya, the proponents of the Muhammadian tradition. And that movement is mostly invested in publishing. So what this movement does is that it enters the incipient printed book market in order to place Salafi authors in a central position in that book market. And this is a huge stake because in the 1920s, it's the beginning of the printing book market. So there is a big question of which books will dominate that new market, right? And Salafis, and I make a case in the book, and this is a bit of a Weberian argument, are quite entrepreneurial in what they're doing. That is, whereas most of the traditional ulama are not aware of those changes in many ways, and they still stick to the old ways of teaching in these little halqas where people sit with each other in Al-Azhar, and they still use traditional ways of transmitting knowledge. The Salafis are much better at understanding that something's going on, and they massively put their efforts into promoting their authors in the book market. And that means that, again, that's one of the things I explain in the book. A number of authors that the Salafis particularly like, Ibn Taymiyyah, who's a scholar from what is now Syria, from the 13th, 14th century, who's a very conservative scholar from the Hanbali tradition, and he's one of the authorities in Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia and Salafism in general. Ibn Kathir, who's a student of Ibn Taymiyyah and who's known for a very, again, conservative and literalist exegesis of the Quran. Those are scholars that the Salafis consider to be core to their understanding of Islam, and that were not known before the 1920s. Those were mostly forgotten scholars. So if you ask anyone in the 19th century, including among the ulama, they would either not know who these people are, or they would consider them to be quite marginal within the tradition. What happens with that drive towards printing and publishing in the 1920s is that the Salafis managed to promote these authors and transform them into authorities, up to the point that today Ibn Taymiyyah is the most quoted author in Islam. That is, he's the number one, and you can see it. You can just check on the internet. Ibn Taymiyyah is the most quoted author. Ibn Kathir, today's exegesis of the Quran, is considered to be by a lot of people to be the standard one. And if you go to an Islamic bookstore and ask for an exegesis, in many places in the world, people would probably give you that one. If you ask for just, can you give me an exegesis, this is the one people would give you. So this is really important, I think, because this has completely gone. I mean, people have not paid attention to this. How a transformation of what is considered to be authoritative within the tradition happened in that first half of the 20th century, and how authors, until then considered marginal, suddenly became considered authoritative. And that didn't happen by a miracle. That happened because movements, and this is one of the movements I'm looking at here in the case of Egypt, were actually pushing for that. There's a number of other movements in that long history of Salafism I described in Egypt that kind of took over the mantle of Salafism, or became the new flag bearers of Salafism in the 1970s, and then there's a number of shifts which I will not describe here for lack of time. But when there's a distinction, that movements are structures that promote a discourse, right? But the discourse, of course, is something that is in many ways more durable than the movement. So this is a little bit what I say in the conclusion of my book, and I don't want again to spoil the conclusion. But what I'm saying is that Salafism today, as a movement, is in crisis. That is, the last 10 years have seen a backlash against Salafism in many places. It has seen that backlash in Egypt, although in Egypt the Salafi movement is still authorized. It's the Salafi a party that went second in the elections in 2011. That party still has 7 MPs in the Egyptian parliament. So Salafis are still politically represented in Egypt, but of course they're much less influential and much less visible than they used to be. Of course, you've seen what's going on in Saudi Arabia with the new government pushing for a transformation of the country's religious discourse. And this is something that you see happening in many other places. So Salafism as movement today is clearly in crisis. But does that mean that Salafism as a discourse will change overnight? No, right? I mean, what I'm saying is conceptions that have been built by Salafis for 100 years, what people believe is authoritative, this will not change overnight because the movements are in crisis. This is a much longer process. Conceptions change. Those conceptions might change eventually. But what I'm saying is that it's not because the movements are in crisis that suddenly people will start to have different beliefs overnight. Beliefs have a much more, I mean, there's different temporalities here, right? The temporality of belief is not the temporality of movements, right? So that's why I argue in the conclusion of my book.
We'll get back to the
Yes.
conclusion later, but especially on this idea that there's almost like this paradox of victory at the ideological level, but more like mixed results in terms of the organizations pushing for that idea. The one interesting element, also one interesting dimension in the book is relation or rivalry between Salafism and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. Because again, for people who are not very familiar with religious ideas in the Middle East, the most obvious actor, especially when it comes to Egypt, during the decades that you cover in the book, the first name that comes to mind is the Muslim Brotherhood. And again, here you provide a very detailed analysis on the let's say the exchanges, the influences, but also the differences between the ideas, between the individuals behind those movements. Can you give us, let's say, just an overview of how you see this evolution in parallel of both Salafism and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's one of the things. So that kind of takes me back to defining what Salafism is, because I think that's key here. What I've been talking about for the last 15 minutes, indeed, is a particular discourse and movement that, to me, needs to be clearly distinguished between Islamism which is embodied by the Muslim Brotherhood. So I start with that distinction of Salafism, those are the movements I talk about, I focus on in my book, and Islamism, represented by the Muslim Brotherhood and its political heirs. The distinction is that, I mean, to begin with, let's put it that way, both in Egypt emerged in the 20th century around the same time. Ansar Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya, the group I mentioned earlier in the talk, the proponents of the Muhammadan tradition, that's a group that's established in 1926. The Muslim Brotherhood is created in 1928. So, with 2 years apart, you have those two religious organizations established in Egypt. Both of them are inspired by the movement of Islamic reform that started in Egypt and the Levant in the late 19th century. So both of them are heirs to that, again, movement of intellectuals in the late 19th century, in the late Ottoman period, who are diagnosing a crisis of the Muslim world, looking for solutions to that crisis, and who believe that Islam, to put it as the Muslim Brotherhood would later put it, Islam is the solution, right? This is what they think. But in the 1920s, the divergence would be in what does it mean for Islam to be the solution? And what is the correct way to advance that solution, right? And so the Muslim Brotherhood and later the Islamists, who they would inspire, believe that change has to be thought fundamentally in political terms. And so the Muslim Brotherhood is fundamentally a political organization which bases itself on a religious discourse, the discourse of Islam. But fundamentally, from the beginning, the Muslim Brotherhood is an organization that wants to transform the state. And the big concept that the Muslim Brotherhood would put forward throughout its history is the concept of the Islamic State, which they would see as some kind of utopia that needs to be implemented. And an Islamic state, they would say, is a state that implements Islamic law, Sharia. And so this would be the main goal and the main discourse of the Muslim Brotherhood throughout its history and later Islamist movements. So, in a sense, driven by this kind of political objective. Salafis believe otherwise. To begin with, Salafis believe that transformation or change can only happen from the grassroots. Salafis are not interested in politics. They don't believe in the state. They don't see, transformation of the state as a goal worth campaigning for. What they believe is in the purification of Islam and the return of Islamic theological conceptions to what Salafis see as the original conceptions. So for Salafis, it is about purifying the creed. And it is about redefining Islam in ways which they see as orthodox by promoting a number of authors from the tradition, and I've mentioned some earlier in the talk. Redefining Islam around these authors as the only possible orthodoxy, and preaching and teaching to others that understanding from the grassroots. So in many ways, Islamists believe in transformation from above. Salafis believe in transformation from below, right? That's what distinguishes them. Islamists are obsessed with politics. Salafis are obsessed with theology. And Salafis have a very restrictive definition of what is the correct theology. And in many ways, Salafis spend a lot of time fighting with other Muslims, right? I mean, what the Salafis do basically when they emerge in Egypt is to write books against the Sufis, to write books against the Shia, to write books against the Ash'aris. Ash'arism being the then dominant school of theological speculation that is represented at the helm of Al-Azhar. So those are the people the Salafis disagree with at the beginning. So Salafism is a movement within Islam of one faction against other Islamic factions to define what is orthodox and what is not. And in contrast, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists have traditionally tried to overcome theological differences in order to because they think like politicians. So they try to appeal to a broader group of individuals in order to form a movement and to better advance their political goal. So those are two very different ways of conceiving of what it means to of what Islamic activism means, right? And and from the beginning, those movements would not be in good terms with each other, right? And so throughout the history of Salafism and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they would actually mostly be at odds with each other, right? The Muslim Brotherhood would accuse the Salafis of, being politically unaware, of not understanding the priorities and not understanding that politics is so important. They would sometimes accuse the Salafis of being stooges of the regime because the Salafis being not interested in politics. And usually, again, trying to create the right conditions to preach, because this is what the Salafis want to do, usually they would be quite accommodative vis-a-vis the regime. And the Muslim Brotherhood would blame them for that. In return, the Salafis would accuse the Muslim Brotherhood of being religiously deviant. They would say the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't care about orthodoxy. They don't care about. They don't really care about Islam, and so they would accuse the Muslim Brotherhood of also being insufficiently orthodox. So those two movements would evolve throughout that history in parallel. And my book really tries to kind of reinstall that fundamental division. Because as you said, most of the books that have spoken about Egypt have focused on the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamism. And to me, that's kind of a problem because of course, the Islamists are much more visible. They make more noise, and that's probably why a lot of people focused on them. I mean, in a sense, scholars are like everyone. They tend to study what is visible and noisy. The Salafis were always very discreet, quite silent. For a very long time, they were, their organizations were quite low key. You didn't really see them. They didn't attract much attention. Yet, what I'm trying to argue in the book is that the transformation that the Salafi movement produced in Egypt is in many ways much more profound and in many ways more durable than whatever noise the Islamists were doing at the top.
So, I mean, and this leads to this moment that you explained in let's say the second part of the book, which is getting closer to our current time. The interesting or the fascinating competition that we see between Salafism, the Muslim Brotherhood, and to a certain extent also the military in Egypt. It almost feels like in the last years of the Mubarak regime, you have this triangle where, as you said earlier, the old regime of Hosni Mubarak, to a certain extent used Salafism, and until the moment it felt it was that the movement was getting out of control for the regime. And again, one thing that you explain in the book is that you have this new president coming from the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Morsi, and contrary to what everyone with no specific expertise would believe, relationship between the Salafis and the Morsi presidency have been much more complex. This was not like a natural ally, a natural partner for Salafism. So how do you see this? And I don't know if we can call it a triangle between the military, the Salafi movements, and the Muslim Brotherhood during that revolutionary period of Egypt, let's say between the moment Mubarak falls in 2011 and the moment the military takes the power back in 2013. So basically just two intense years.
Yes, thank you. I like the triangle idea because this is really what I'm trying to say in the book. That is, basically, most books about religious politics in Egypt have kind of looked at the bilateral relationship between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood and the kind of the recurrent clashes between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood. And what I'm trying to argue, it's a triangle, as you said. So it's the brothers, the Salafis, and the state. And you cannot understand what's happening in that relationship if you don't take into account the three members of that relationship. And you're right, as you said, during the Mubarak days, the regime of Mubarak clearly played the Salafi card against the Muslim Brotherhood, and that in many ways contributed to what I'm saying here, that by the late 2000s, the Salafis had established some form of religious hegemony, and they were really helped under Mubarak by the regime, because the regime considered that because Salafis didn't play politics, then they were much less of a threat. Salafis at that point are still very, again, focused on preaching, focused on the grassroots, not interested in change from above. And so faced with the opposition of the Muslim Brotherhood, and remember that in 2005 already, in elections that were probably freer than any previous election in Egypt. And that happened in the wake of the Iraq War, when the neoconservatives in the US were pushing for democratization in the region. Mubarak felt that he needed to have more open elections in order to give a good image of himself to the neoconservatives in Washington. And in those elections, which were not free elections, but freer elections than before, the Muslim Brotherhood already won 88 seats. And that's 2005, long before the revolution. And that kind of, I think, completely convinced the regime that, the Muslim Brotherhood were the main threats, and that anything the regime could use against the Muslim Brotherhood would be justified. And that is when one thing that would happen in that period is the creation of all these Salafi TV channels, which were broadcasting on Nilesat, that is on the official Egyptian satellites, therefore requiring a license that was given to them. So the fact that they had a license clearly shows that this was also a political decision to let them broadcast. And so in the late 2000s, Egypt's public sphere is filled with all these Salafi satellite TV channels. Now let's come to the revolution, because that's your question. That was just a quick introduction to that. When the revolution happens, one thing that no one expects, or that very few people expect, is that the Salafis suddenly decide that they also want to become political. And I think this is something that, basically seems to challenge all the previous assumptions. I mean, what I've told you until now is that what distinguished the Salafis and the Islamists is that the Salafis were not interested in politics, that they didn't care for the state, that they were focused on the grassroots. But when the revolution happens in 2011, the biggest Salafi movement in Egypt, known as the Da'wah Salafiyya, I said earlier in the talk that there were several movements in that story. So the Da'wah Salafiyya, or what you can translate as the Salafi call, was established in the late 1970s. And by the late 2000s, it had emerged as the strongest organized Salafi social movement in the country, with a very strong and organized grassroots presence. In 2011, in the wake of the revolution, there are internal debates within the Salafi call, the Dawah Salafi. I'm going to call them the Salafi call by the English translation of their name. So there are internal debates in the Salafi call. And there is one faction within the call that eventually wins the day that says we need to create a political party. That is, we cannot abandon the space to others. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood created its own political party, but everyone expected that. The Muslim Brotherhood from the beginning was interested in that. But finally, the Salafi call decides to do the same. And you have also other smaller Salafi organizations that create their own political parties. So in 2011, you actually have about 10 Salafi parties in Egypt. But the only one that really matters is the one created by the Salafi call, because it's much larger than all the others. Now, why? And that's, I think, the source of a number of misunderstandings when the Salafis decide to create a party. It's the source of misunderstandings, and you can see it if you go back to what people were writing back then. Because suddenly people say, oh, Salafis, they've become Islamists. They now have a local party, they want to seize power. So Salafis have just become a new faction of the Islamists. And what I'm trying to argue in the book is that despite the fact that they created a political party, their conceptions never really changed. And what I'm trying to argue in the book is that the Salafis understand in 2011, and I can see that from studying, what they were writing back then, the internal debates that they had, etc., etc. What they're thinking in 2011 is that since now there is no established political power anymore, everything is up for grabs. And so, if they want to protect their religious movement and their ability to transform society from below, which they still believe is the only correct thing to do, then they need to have someone defending their interests at the political level. So when that party, it's called the Noor Party, Hizb Noor, right? It's the party that the Salafi cult creates in 2011. So when the Noor Party is established, its goal is not to seize power. Its goal is to create a political lobby within the parliament that is able to bargain with other political forces in order to win advantages and prevent losses to the religious organization that is behind it. This is very key because that explains many things. That explains why in the presidential election of 2012, the Noor Party would not present a candidate because they're not interested in winning the presidency. And in many ways, you could argue they're not interested in governing. The party is not meant to govern. This is a party that is meant to bargain, right? And what they want is to advance the interest of the religious organization. Fundamentally, the Muslim Brotherhoods to them are a threat because they believe that if the Muslim Brotherhood seizes the state, if the Muslim Brotherhood wins the elections, and if the Muslim Brotherhood controls the government, what the Muslim Brotherhood will do is to use its political dominance to put the religious sphere under control. And so for the Salafis, they believe that the Muslim Brotherhood is more of a threat than any other force because the Muslim Brotherhood is a political organization, but one that if it wins politically, will try to put religion under control and so will exclude them from the religious sphere and take away their mosques, to put it bluntly. So the Salafis are convinced that if the brothers win, they will take away their mosque and they will put Brotherhood imams instead of them. And so that competition drives, I think, a lot of the rivalry that happens in that period. That explains why in the first elections of late 2011, their parliamentary elections, Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis run against each other. And the Muslim Brotherhood eventually comes first. They earn 45% of the votes. But the Salafi party is second with 25%, which makes it, you have a big Islamic bloc in the parliament, right? At that point, 45% for the brothers, 25% for the Salafis. The Salafi bloc is big enough for the Salafis to kind of do the kind of bargaining that they were hoping to do. When the presidential election happens, again, the Salafis do not back the Brotherhood. And the Salafis do not want to present a candidate. So very strangely, the Salafis actually join a multi-party alliance to back what has been described back then as a centrist Islamic candidate. It's called Abdel Munim Abul Futuh. And in many ways, he's much more liberal than Mohammed Morsi. And it's very strange that the Salafis would back him because he's a person that has very little to do with them. But again, the Salafis don't want the brothers to win. And so they decide to back the candidate who they seem has the biggest chance of winning against Morsi. And you have forces from the secular left backing the same candidate as the Salafis. So you can see that this is all politics at that point. Again, that doesn't work. That candidate loses. And so when Morsi wins, the Salafis start to be really, really in panic. And their relationship with the Brotherhood, well, I mean, they would try at some point to find some kind of compromise with the Brotherhood initially to protect themselves. They would agree with the Brotherhood to work on the constitution together. And that's the only moment in that period where there was Salafi Brotherhood cooperation, and it led to the most conservative constitution ever adopted by Egypt, right? It was the constitution adopted in January 2013, which again is the more Islamically conservative constitution ever adopted in Egypt, and one of the many reasons why a lot of secular Egyptians felt that this was becoming a threat to their lives, and eventually decided to back the military. But as soon as this happened, the Salafis turned against the brothers again and allied with the other political forces to bring down Morsi. And the Salafis were one of the groups that supported the military takeover in July 2013 when President Sisi made his case. There's this big speech, very famous speech, when General Sisi on the 3rd of July 2013 announces that Morsi is no longer president and that the army is taking over the political transition. Behind him are sitting representatives of different political forces, including the head of the Noor party, right? So yeah, eventually, I mean, that competition would and that rivalry would go so far as to basically the Salafis eventually backing the military against the brothers.
So, I mean, and before I ask the question, let me just remind my colleagues that if you want to ask a question, please use the chat box. We have about 20 minutes left, so we should have time for a few questions. But I'd like us, as we reach the conclusion, and we reach in terms of the history, we reach the current time. We discussed, let's say, the dynamics of Salafism within the context of domestic politics in Egypt. One thing that you acknowledge around the end of the book is how, during that period, especially in the 2010s and until now, Egypt became, if I can say, almost like a battleground for regional geopolitics, especially Gulf states. And you acknowledge in particular how the UAE and to a lesser extent, maybe until now, Saudi Arabia played a role in, let's say, supporting a different view of Islam and what I think you call a neo-traditional approach of Islam, where if we look at the rhetoric coming from Abu Dhabi, um, any expression of political Islam is considered unauthorized, at least politically. There's almost like a very broad understanding of what is considered to be terrorist organizations that would include a lot of organizations with loose affiliations with either Salafi movements or Muslim Brotherhood. So, can you first elaborate on what you see as this neo-traditional approach coming from the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and how does that impact the movements that you observed in Egypt?
Yeah, I mean, so neo-traditionalism is what a lot of scholars have. It's a term that a lot of scholars have used for this kind of how can I say, movement that emerges in the 2000s. So it's before the Arab Spring, where you start to see a network of scholars trying to make traditional Islam appealing again, right? So what they understand is that in many ways, one of the reasons why traditional Islam has been losing ground to Salafis and Muslim brothers is that traditional Islam has not been able to adapt its discourse to a modern audience, that traditional Islam has not been able to produce the same kind of charismatic figures that the other movements have produced, has not been able to be present in the same spaces. And so in the 2000s, you start to see a relatively coordinated effort to push for the emergence and kind of networking of a number of figures. And prominent ones are someone like Ali Gum'a, who was the former Mufti of Egypt, someone like Al-Bouti, who is one of the most famous scholars in Syria, and he would be killed during the civil war. So this is before the civil war. Someone like Al Habib Ali Jifri, who is a Yemeni and who is a prominent figure in the Ba'alawi Sufi Brotherhood, and who is based in the UAE. And so start to see that network of scholars being, I mean, gaining ground. Some of them, Ali Gumaha or Al-Jifri, are very quite charismatic. You see them on TV, you see them on social networks. And this all happens with, indeed, I mean, support from the UAE. So the UAE understands that this is, in order to counter Salafism and Islamism, an alternative needs to be supported with resources, right? And so, in the context of the revolution, and in the context of what happened in Egypt back then in 2011, 2013, I think the UAE and Saudi Arabia are mostly on the same side. I mean, they don't. I mean, obviously, they're not happy with the Arab Spring. They don't see any of this leading to any good. They are particularly wary of the Muslim Brotherhood, but they're not fans of the Salafis either, including Saudi Arabia. And I think this is a common misunderstanding here that Saudi Arabia backed the Salafis in 2011, which I think is not true, because the Saudi Arabia at that point was already, I mean, like this kind of organized Salafism that creates a political party is already too much for Saudi Arabia, right? Since the 1990s, Saudi Arabia's policy towards Islamic movement had been changing. In the wake of the Gulf War, Saudi Arabia faced its own domestic Islamist opposition. And after that, the Saudis gradually moved to a position when they were not willing to bet on these movements anymore. Again, they would use them strategically sometimes in certain battlegrounds. But in the case of Egypt, there's no very strong connection with the Salafi call. The Saudis are a bit wary of them. They find them too uncontrollable. So the UAE and the Saudis are mostly supporting the army back then. This is the actor with who they trust. And so in the wake of the military takeover in Egypt, and in the wake of the chaos that develops in Syria and the civil war and all of these regional events, the UAE continues to push for neo-traditionalism as an alternative to all these different movements, right? And neo-traditionalists, I mean, one important moment in this kind of rise of neo-traditionalism is in 2014 when a new organization was established in the UAE called the Committee of Muslim Elders, right? Which was created by the UAE to counter another organization which had been created in Doha by the Qataris. And that older organization was known as the Committee of Muslim Scholars. And that the Committee of Muslim Scholars by Qatar was known to be close to the Muslim Brotherhood. So in return, the UAE organized its own committee with, again, some of the scholars I mentioned earlier, but also the Sheikh of Al-Azhar backing it, in order to, again, present the neo-traditionalist alternative. So that has been going on for a while, and it's true that I mean, neo-traditionalism has clearly been on the rise. I mean, there's clearly been, to some extent, right? I mean, the crisis of political Islam and the crisis of Salafism has opened a new void. And the question is, what will fill the void? So one thing that is filling the void now is all these religious influencers who do not really belong to anything. I mean, you can see a lot of them in the Arab world right now. It's really difficult to kind of classify them ideologically. Some of these religious influencers are a mix of many of the things we've spoken about in this talk. But you also clearly have an increasing appeal of kind of these traditionalists or neo-traditionalists to some extent. I'm not saying it's a huge extent, because again, I think there still remains a battle of who for who will fill the void. But yeah, I hope I responded to your question somehow.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. One question I got from one of our colleagues relates to the connections that you may have seen or not seen between Salafism between Egypt and the Gulf, but also with Southeast Asia. As you probably know, there's always in the scholarship looking at Southeast Asia this concept of Arabization, the idea that a lot of what we see in the expression of political Islam in Southeast Asia is in some ways influenced or taken from the Arabian Peninsula. Have you seen in your research, I mean, maybe not just for the book, because the book doesn't cover that, but have you seen any connection to the between those Salafi movements and what we witness in Southeast Asia? That's the basically the question.
Yeah, I mean, not much the ones from Egypt. I mean, to some extent, there have been some students from Southeast Asia who, because many students from Southeast Asia study at Al Azhar, right? This remains one of the prime destinations for students from Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asians are the main foreign community of students at Al Azhar. So, of course, in the context of Egypt, when Salafi discourse was quite hegemonic, you would expect students coming from abroad to, despite studying at Al Azhar and maybe learning a more traditional version of Islam, also be affected by the general Islamic discourse in the country and all these Salafi sheikhs who were immensely popular back then. So you certainly had some kind of influence going on through some of the students who went to Al Azhar and while being in Egypt would be influenced by the kind of Islamic discourse they would find, not necessarily in Al Azhar, but in other places. Um, but um, but again, for what I know, and I'm not in a capacity to speak about this because this is kind of out of my research in many ways. But from what I understand, I mean, at least for Salafi movements, the channel was mostly the Islamic University of Medina. So it was not so much. I mean, what happened in Egypt was not, it was just individuals who might, because they were in Egypt at the time when Salafism was popular, who might have been influenced by Salafi conceptions while in Egypt. But it was not the kind of organized effort of the kind that the Islamic University of Medina represented, because there you would have people from all over the Islamic world coming to study and to learn Islam in Salafi terms, usually with scholarships, and after graduating, coming back to their home countries. And so in the case of the Islamic University of Medina, you would have a much more systematic effort at, I mean, again, that was all part of the proselytizing efforts that I talked about. And today, that are kind of disconnected today, there's much less interest in any of these on part of the current Saudi state. But again, if we go back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you would find a lot of that. So I think that was more the channel. I think when Egypt was the channel, it was kind of probably a bit more anecdotal to some extent. But there, I mean, but there has to be again an Egyptian connection in a way because again so many Southeast Asians studied Al Azhar, and I would need to look at the profiles exactly and see what. So that's a bit of my intuition here, but yeah, it's a bit out of my league, but.
No problem. I received another question which relates to the field work, and I'm actually curious also to hear your answer. How difficult was it for you to do the research for this book? And I mean, as I read it, I kept thinking that for a French researcher covering Egypt during that period, since the revolution. and probably even before that, it must have been quite difficult and challenging at the time. You mentioned in the book very quickly the case of this young Italian PhD student, Giulio Regeni, who got killed because of his research on the ground there. So, how difficult was it for you to do the research for this book?
Well, I was kind of lucky. It's certainly not easy, but I was kind of lucky because the bulk of my interviews happened during I mean, a little bit before the revolution, the late Mubarak period, and until the military takeover in 2013. That is really when I did the bulk of my interviews. The research I continued after that was more kind of, speaking to people in the diaspora or reading the huge amount of documents I had and books and anything I had collected and that I spent years basically going through. There was a lot of reading involved. You can see in the bibliography of the book, it's quite big. So, but when it comes to the interviews, I was quite lucky because this happened during the so-called revolutionary period. And that was a pretty good moment because there was the idea that there was everything was up to grabs. All of these movements were suddenly becoming public actors who were running for elections, who were openly campaigning all the time. Many of their representatives were on TV. I mean, it's difficult to imagine now, but in 2011, a typical night in Cairo is like a bunch of talk shows on Egyptian channels, and on each of these talk shows, you have like a Salafi, a Muslim brother, a pro Mubarak, leftist, and they're all arguing with each other, and so many of these Salafis were completely, marginalized, and brothers were never invited before 2011. Suddenly, you see them on TV all day. They this kind of and eventually, I mean, they become 70% of the parliament together. So it's a period where, it's not that difficult in the sense that because they've become public figures and because these movements have become public movements at that point, there's no question anymore of these being some kind of militant movement that is very difficult to access. Those only become mainstream public movements who become eventually late 2011 number one and number two in Egyptian politics, right? One is number one, Salafis are number two. So, and I think it is also a moment when they are seeking attention. They are keen to tell their story, and I kind of come at the right moment in a way because they kind of feel that they're emerging from the darkness in many ways, and so they're quite happy to have people asking them to tell their stories. So I think I was kind of lucky because it wouldn't have been easy to do after 2013. It wasn't as easy to do under Mubarak, although in the late Mubarak period, it was kind of okay, but it was not as much, it was not as public as it became during that period. So again, I was lucky to be there at the moment when you could actually collect that kind of interviews and everything.
Well, thank you very much, and we're lucky to have had the pleasure to listen to you and to read the book, which let me emphasize highlight how much it relies on the field work. That this is not like a book that is disconnected from the literature. And as you said, I mean, there's I think some 10, 15 pages of local books that you provide at the end in the bibliography, which evidences the extent of the research. Let me remind everyone that the book is called Twilight of the Saints, The History of and Politics of Salafism in Contemporary Egypt by Stéphane Lacroix, published by Columbia University Press. This ends our session. Stéphane, thank you very much for taking the time to join us for this talk. Thank you for everyone also to listen and to ask questions. And have a nice day in Paris or in Singapore. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.